see. So, hi, Dr. Wildcat. Again, this is our traditional medicines class, Traditional Indian Medicines 405. It's sponsored through the Mexican American Studies Department at the University of Arizona. I'm the instructor, Millicent Michelle Pepion. I represent the Navajo and Blackfeet Nations. I'm really honored to have you here. Thank you for being here. First met you over there in Lawrence, Kansas at the, I think it was at the Medicine Wheel, or I think when I first met you, we were like talking about all these animals that were trying to cross the street.
Oh, yeah.
They had drained a part of they had drained a part of the Medicine Wheel, and we're like, Dr. Wildcat. And, but anyway, I stumbled upon your office that one day, and we've just been friends ever since. And you know, I consider you one of my father figures. So really happy to have you here. And if you could just share with us your story about, you know, growing up and how you came to Haskell and how you got into this work that you do.
Yeah.
And I'll give you the floor now.
Yeah, Sanlai, Gadasawa, Galasan, Sangele, Zoyaha, Yuchiha, Muskogee, Shadane, Adene. Good afternoon, everyone. How are you? I am a Zoyaha, a Yuchi member of the Muskogee Nation, Creek Nation of Oklahoma, and my name is Wildcat. And I just can't tell you how delighted I am here to join Millie in this class. And yeah, you know, there's a lot to talk about, and so we'll kind of just let the conversation flow here, Millie. But in terms of, you know, let me say, first of all, you know, to you know, honor the very place I'm sitting. If you can tell, I'm in my home office here in Lawrence, Kansas. I'm sitting probably less than, I don't know, maybe a third of a mile from the south bank of the Kansas River. And I'm about 2 miles north of the Wakarusa wetlands, which sits on the north bank of the Wakarusa River and forms the southern part of the Haskell campus. And we'll get into the whole story of the Wakarusa wetlands and the South Lawrence Traffic Way. That's kind of a part of a story that we share, Millie. But yeah, so I want to honor this very place I'm sitting. I want to honor the first earth keepers of this place. That would be the Kaw people, the Kanza, and the relatives to the east and to the south, the Osage. Both had, you know, were very familiar with this. I think the Kaw were probably had the longest residency here. And how ironic is it that they're the Kaw Nation constitutes the people from which Kansas gets its name. They were known as the Kanza sometime, and that's how Kansas got its name, from Kanza. And due to the depredations of federal Indian policy, they've been removed in north central Oklahoma. So what can you say? There's a good example of, you know, the twists and turns and the injustices of federal Indian policy. So they were removed out of the place where I'm sitting down to north central Oklahoma. But yeah, my story is you're going to have to wait to get the full-blown version when I write my autobiography. But it's interesting you asked me to start there because I've just recently been interviewed about that too, for a book that's coming out in Lawrence, Kansas. I'll make sure you get a copy when it comes out, Millie. But you know, they asked me to talk about Haskell, but they started out asking questions about, well, tell us a little bit about yourself. And as it turned out, that ended up being probably the larger part of this chapter that I'm included in about, you know, kind of Lawrence, Kansas, contemporary history. But yeah, I was born right on the Kansas-Oklahoma border. If we have any people familiar with northeastern Oklahoma, you know that if you go just straight north of Tulsa towards Kansas, you know, you're going to come, when you get to the Kansas border, to a little town called Coffeyville, Kansas. And Coffeyville's claim to fame is it was the home of the famous Dalton gang, the Dalton gang, that the outlaws. They were sort of like the James gang. The Dalton gang tried to rob 2 banks at once in Coffeyville and met their demise. I think of the 3 brothers, all but one was killed, and again the other members of their gang met their demise in that attempt. But that's kind of one of the parts of Coffeyville history, that people still talk about, and that's kind of where it fits in this kind of narrative of settler, Western history. So I have a rich heritage. My dad was what we would call, quote unquote, full-blood Yuchee, Zoyaha. He grew up in Sapulpa, Oklahoma. And a lot of my relatives still live around Sapulpa, Mounds, Kellyville, Oklahoma. That's kind of Yuchee territory in northeastern Oklahoma. My mom was a classic, like really non-native, small farm country girl. And my dad and all of his uncles, the reason my brother and I were born in Coffeyville, the explanation for that goes this way. My dad and all of his brothers and my aunts attended. I'm still not clear whether they graduated from Chilocco or not. I think for sure my Aunt Josephine did, but my dad and his 2 brothers and sisters attended Chilocco Indian boarding school in north central Oklahoma. And he was trained there as a typesetter. That was one of the things that the boarding schools really focused on, learn to learn a trade. So when he was going to school at Chilocco, he was trained to be a typesetter. And he was scheduled to graduate, right in 1944. He, as soon as he graduated from Chilocco, he went into the military service. Now, this wasn't uncommon during this time, in the 40s and World War II going on. We all know the stories of, the contributions that Indigenous people made to winning the war with the code talkers and those kinds of activities. But my dad enlisted in the Marines and ended up actually not seeing combat, but being sent to China. And if any of you know the stories about the Japanese occupation of parts of China, my dad was part of a Marine detachment that was sent to China. And then after the war, when they found a lot of the horrible practices that the Japanese were engaged in against Chinese people, my dad was sort of deployed in a Marine detachment that was part of helping get that mess kind of settled and to try to bring some kind of order out of that chaos. But I think the war actually ended. I think the atomic bombs were dropped actually when he was on a boat on his way to the Pacific, and then ended up going to China because the Japanese surrendered. And that was his experience there. When he got out of the Army, the Marines, the first thing he did was, look for a job, and he found a job in a small paper in Coffeyville, Kansas. That's how my dad got to Coffeyville, Kansas, and just out of the Marine Corps after the Second World War. And, was, on his own, a bachelor, got a job at the Coffeyville Journal, got an apartment fairly close to the community college in Coffeyville, Kansas, Coffeyville Community College, and met my mom. And my mom was going to school there at the time, training to be a teacher. Okay. So anyway, my mom and dad met. They fell in love. Both families were shocked. I think my dad's indigenous family was going, "What? Who is this white woman that Nathaniel's going to marry?" And I think my mom's basically, I think that most of them were of English descent, probably some Scotch-Irish in there somewhere. Her maiden name is Andrews. And we do know that they before they came to the United States, they were residing in Wales. So maybe there's some Welsh background there too. Okay. But anyway, they fell in love, and her family was shocked, like, why is she marrying this Indian guy? And my brother and I were born, and we lived there just a short time in Coffeyville. And then my dad got the opportunity to go to Tulsa again. Now that was where his family was at. My mom's family was all around Coffeyville, and just about all of them country folks, had small farms, not the way we think of farming today, with people have sections of land and big combines and everything. I'm talking about small farms. They might raise, they might have a few pigs. This would be something people in Oklahoma would resonate with, maybe in other places too. But I might have some pigs, some chickens. I remember when I was very young that they did have a milk cow, but always, chickens, pigs, and then a garden that they farmed. By the time I was born, my only one of my dad's parents that was still living was his father, Maxie Wildcat. And, my dad lost his mother. I think she had what was very common, for people in Indian country in the 20s, 30s, clear and through the 40s. TB, they used to refer to it as consumption, but tuberculosis is what killed my grandmother. And she died when my father was very young. So he was raised by his grandma. And, interesting story. He was very fluent in language up until he was about nine years old. And then he got sent 10 years old and then got sent to Chilocco. And you don't use it, you lose it, I guess. And that was the story of a lot of boarding school kids. And it was really interesting growing up. I would ask him to teach me Yuchi, and it was always a struggle because he could remember, like words, but if you just ask him to teach you kind of a conversational style, it was like he just couldn't do that. And this is a funny story about languages, about community, about engagement, and the way we are related, what that means to our cultures. One of the things that was really fascinating to me was, so my dad, I'd say, teach me some Yuchi, and he'd say, well, I can teach you, hi, goodbye, so on, a few words. But I noticed that when we lived in Tulsa, we would often go to all of my Yuchi relatives at that point in time. Most of my Yuchi relatives were very active in the Indian Methodist churches. So if you're from Oklahoma, the churches are kind of divided up between Catholics, Baptists. Methodists had a really large role in northeastern Oklahoma in setting up their schools and their missionary efforts. And so my ancestors converted to Christianity vis-a-vis the Methodist Church. And so there was an Indian, what we would say, my aunts would say, an Indian church. It was really a Creek and Yuchee church that my ancestors helped set up, called Pickett Chapel, just south of Sapulpa. Any of you, if you ever go to Sapulpa and you meet Indian people, you just say, well, where's Pickett Chapel? And they can probably tell you, dirt road used to be a dirt road. It's paved now, but just south of Sapulpa, Oklahoma. And I remember going there because it was really interesting when his uncles and stuff would come up to him and start speaking Yuchi to him. It was really weird because I would notice that when they were talking to him, he could kind of slip into it. It was sort of like, okay, I'm in this space and it's safe and it's good. And it was almost like some of that language ability, that indigenous language ability, would come back to him. And he could, not, be fluent, but he could kind of have a discussion with his uncles, or at least follow what they were talking about and understand their jokes, which I couldn't understand. But when they start laughing, I knew they were telling Yuchi jokes. But so, when after we left Coffeyville, my dad got a job at the Tulsa World. We lived there for about three years. I got really connected with all my Yuchi relatives. We would go from Tulsa to Sapulpa and to the Pickett Chapel, often to go to church. That'll be a whole chapter in my biography, because I learned a lot about Yuchi people, and even about how there are aspects of their culture that are maintained even within these Indian churches. They do things a little differently than if you went to my mom's Christian churches, which were usually Baptist or that kind of affiliated denomination. And so lived there till I was about in second grade, and we moved back to Coffeyville. Interestingly enough, my dad got a job, got encouraged to go back, and made a good offer, to come back to Coffeyville and work at the Coffeyville Journal, the paper there. Took it, and that's really where my brother and I grew up, okay, in Coffeyville, Kansas. And my brother's just a little over 2 years younger than me. Very talented artist, Philip Dwayne Wildcat. If you kind of Google him, you can find some of his artwork. A very incredible artist. But so, my life was very much this early experience with my Yuchi relatives. Then we moved back to Coffeyville, and then it was again my mom's very large family, and it was a very, very large family. My grandfather had, by his first wife, 4 children. By my grandma, who maiden name was Baker, but she became an Andrews when she married my grandfather, had 6 daughters. And so big farm families. And then my grandmother had 2 children. So just a large farm family. So, it was really interesting growing up, seeing 2 very distinct sort of social environments, cultural environments, where people lived, how they lived. And I think that, it's probably had a profound impact on my scholarship too, in terms of how I'm always thinking in a very comparative thing of indigenous traditions compared to settler or colonial traditions. And that's really kind of shaped a lot of my work. And of course, that was a lot of Vine Deloria Jr.'s work too. So anyway, went through high school, and my joke my standard joke, and I'll try to, make the last 50 years of my life, just give you a little capsule. But my joke about graduating high school is the only thing I ever won, I lost. So it's the very end of the Vietnam War, right? 1971, 72. And when they did the draft lottery, 365 days in a year, they put the little balls in, each had a number 1 through 365 for 19 people who were born in 1952, the year I was born. The first number they pulled out of the bin there for draft was my birthday, December 4th, 1952. And I wasn't even paying attention. I still remember to this day, one of my best friends there in Coffeyville called me up and said, Dan, are you sitting down? And I said, no. I said, what's up? And he says, well, he says, they did the draft lottery today. And I said, yeah, what of it? And he says, when's your birthday? And I told him, he says, yeah, you better sit down because you're going to Vietnam. And I said, oh, really? And he said, your draft lottery number was 1. And, so I went into the service for 2 years into the Army. Again, my life is full. Our lives, work certain ways. My life has been full of good fortune. There are a lot of times when things could have turned a very bad way, but I was fortunate and things went the other way. So my military service was very unconventional, but I was not sent to Vietnam. I ended up, and there's a long story about this, but what I finally ended up doing for my 2 years in the Army was working as a weather observer at White Sands Missile Range in southern New Mexico. And very unconventional 2 years in the military service because the weather station at White Sands Missile Range was almost all civilian employees, weather forecasters. I was a weather observer. All the observers were U.S. Army, but we learned how to do the charts, upper air charts by hand, which now all that's done by computers. But they'd roll off these big printouts of upper air winds at 5K, 5,000 feet, 10,000 feet, 20,000 feet, 25,000 feet. These were weather balloons, right, that would go up. And they had machines that would print out these things, and then you would do the translations and show where the winds were, what their direction were, mark velocities, so on and so forth. So it was a fascinating way to be in the Army. Got out of the Army, used the GI Bill, came to Lawrence, Kansas. I decided I was going to use I had the GI Bill, so I thought, what the heck, I'm going to go to the University of Kansas. And my cousins had several cousins that were going to school, at Haskell at the time. But I thought, well, I've got the GI Bill. I'm just going to go to KU. While I was in the service, I married my wife, my high school sweetheart. Now that's very unusual. Here's something that's hard to realize. So I am one of these guys who married, not quite, almost 50 years ago, his high school sweetheart, and am still married to her. And that probably says a lot about her patience in living with me. But anyway, and she's non-native. She grew up in a little town north of Coffeyville called Fredonia, Kansas. But this is the interesting thing. So Coffeyville, when I was growing up, had about 16,000, 17,000 people. There were 3 recognizable Indigenous families in Coffeyville when I was growing up. The Wildcats, the Bennetts, who were Cherokee, and the Hares, Hare, who were Lakota. And we were the only really recognizable indigenous people in that small town of Coffeyville, Kansas. And I've said this before, this kind of gets into interesting discussions about ethnicity, community, racism. You know, there weren't enough Indians for anyone to feel threatened by. So we were in Coffeyville, Kansas, the folding was sort of, well, you're not quite white, but you're not black. And in other words, Coffeyville was a very racist community, but it was all black versus white. And if you weren't black, maybe you were Latino, maybe you were, you know, at the time they would say Mexican. And there's a pretty substantial community there in Coffeyville. But I know for the Bennetts, the Hares, and myself, the Wildcats, we were just sort of looked at as, well, you're not black, so you're in with us. And I can honestly say, other than the kind of ignorance you hear, you know, just generally shared about a lack of knowledge and understanding about indigenous people, I never, in Coffeyville, when I was growing up, remember suffering very overt racism like some of my cousins did in Oklahoma, you know, just for being Native. And so it was a very, very white-black, you know, so Coffeyville was one of these towns like you can find throughout the South and the Midwest, really. We had railroad tracks that went north to south and kind of made a natural boundary between the east side of Coffeyville and the west side. And the blacks all lived in the northeast part of Coffeyville, in the places closest to what? Closest to the oil refinery, which no one wants to live in a backyard of an oil refinery, right? So here we go, environmental justice or injustice. The blacks all live over there in their community next to a refinery, okay? Not where anyone would want to live or build a home. And so that was kind of my experience growing up, seeing racism very, very, since most of my growing up was in Coffeyville, small town where, again, there weren't enough of us to ever be perceived as threats, that I just sort of, you know, got along with you know, all the Native students. I never, of course, harbored any kind of racist attitudes, but you didn't really hang out, you know, with Black students, and it was a very, very segregated community in a lot of ways. And anyway, but you know, I digress. I'll use up this whole time just telling this life story. So to wrap up, I come to KU, have a GI Bill, get a bachelor's, a master's degree here. My son is born here in 1977. Okay. Haken Daniel Wildcat. Lucky he still lives here. He went away to California for a little while, but came back. He has a family here now. I have two grandkids. And, you know, I got a bachelor's and a master's degree, was working on a PhD, and a man named Charlie Gibo from Haskell came to see me in about the fall of 1985. I was working on a PhD. And he said, oh, one of your colleagues who had taken a job at Haskell. He had gotten his dissertation done, and they hired him at Haskell. And then he told Charlie Gibo, I've got this friend, he's, you know, Native, and he's in the sociology department at KU. You ought to go interview him. And his name is Charlie Gibo, and I still remember him coming to my office. I was a teaching assistant. This is a really fascinating part of my life history. I was a assistant instructor, and get this, the Western Civilization program at KU. So for 3 years, I taught courses, lecture courses in Western civilization. Served me really well because I really got to understand the Western mind. And so that used to be, this shows you how education has changed. That used to be one of the kind of the liberal arts requirements. All students at University of Kansas had to take 2 semesters of Western Civ. Don't do that anymore. But I taught in that program for 3 years and really, learned a lot about Western thinking and how the Western mind works. And that was always one of the compliments I thought was really nice of Vine to make when our book came out and he was at the ACES National Conference. I didn't see his presentation, but my colleague came back and said, "Hey, you got quite a compliment from Vine Deloria." He said that my co-author Dan Wildcat is a much more knowledgeable student of Western philosophy than I am. But and I thought, wow. So and we had some discussions about that too. He thought that came as a great advantage because if you want to change things, it kind of helps to know who your enemies are and what the obstacles are, and especially how they think. And I really, that was a valuable experience for me to teach 3 years in that program. We used to jokingly call it Plato to NATO. We'd start with the ancient Greeks and we'd end up with, Albert Einstein's famous essay on atomic war or peace. And then the last year I taught we'd even kind of folded in Alexander Solzhenitsyn's work. So we moved up into the 20th century. So Plato to NATO was the joke I always used to tell. Well, I teach Plato to NATO. And anyway, so I got this opportunity. Charlie Gibo came to me from Haskell, said, "You want to come out to Haskell? We've got a sociology position." And I was kind of burnt out on my PhD, quite frankly, at the time, my PhD program. And so I said, yeah, I think I'd like to do that. And so my first day of classes was, I think, something like January 11th, 1986. First day I stepped foot on campus and started teaching. And so I had a bachelor's, I had a master's degree, and Haskell just really has been a very formative part of my scholarship, my work, because if you have any kind of ethnocentric notions of who Indigenous people are, you come to Haskell and you'll be disabused of that very quickly. Millie can tell you all about this. Yes, we have the blue-eyed, blonde-haired Cherokees. Yes, we have Seminole, Choctaw, Black Indians, on our campus. And we have, kids from Second Mesa in Arizona and the Adirondacks in the east, Wabanaki Confederacy in Maine, Seminoles, you name it. You get, we are the international tribal college, really. We are the United Nations of Indigenous higher education in the United States. And that's what's kept me here. That's how I met Vine Deloria Jr. That's how I met Alfonso Ortiz. That's how I met Clara Sue Kidwell. This is, if I weren't here, I don't know if I would have ever met the legendary Billy Frank Jr. of the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission. That's how I met Thomas Benyakua, the Hopi Messenger. That's how I met Oren Lyons. That's how I met. I could go on and on, of all of these incredible people. Dr. Henrietta Mann, from being at Haskell. And I've learned a lot, because that's one of the things that Vine used to always talk about. He says, when you're around, particularly elders, like maybe even think of your own families, aunties and uncles, if you're lucky enough to still have living grandparents. He'd always say, listen. He says, because you can learn a lot if you listen to those conversations that they have. And he always used to talk about his dad was Vine Deloria's dad. Vine Sr. was an Episcopal priest that served the Pine Ridge Reservation, the Ogallala Lakota. And he used to make, his dad would make these visits, around to the people in his, church. And his dad would take Vine with him. And he said, I learned really early on that if I just listen to the stories these old people told and what they talked about, that I would learn a lot. He says, it took me a while. My dad kept saying, be quiet. Just sit there, just listen, Vine, and you'll learn something. And I think that's something that I've really tried to embody. Is I think listening is very the most important communication skill we have. And so I try to be a good listener. And anyway, but I met Vine Deloria Jr. I was teaching at Haskell. I met Vine at UC Berkeley in the summer of '87 in a National Endowment of the Humanities program, where he came in to meet with a bunch of Indigenous scholars for a week, and I was one of them, and we hit it off. And then we started correspondence, and after I got back to Haskell, we kept communicating. And the whole reason I'm in a PhD program is because of Vine Deloria Jr. I wasn't going to do a PhD. I said, I don't need a PhD. I just want to teach. You don't need a PhD to write. If you want to write, just write books, okay? And so I was starting to write a book, and I had a friend I had met through Vine, through the WSSA, the Western Social Science Association. Now, here's something I got to put in a plug. Vine created this whole, cohort of Indigenous scholars that he helped shape. And he did that while at U of A, and he did it because he would take those students to the Western Social Science Association, which even back in those days, those conferences were really pretty much dominated by cowboy historians. I mean, it was really the Western Social Science Association, but he helped create the American Indian Studies section in that meeting. And so we started meeting at those meetings, and, we developed a really good relationship, and that culminated in him asking me in the fall of 2000. The fall of 1999, if I would be a co-author in this book, Power and Place, Indian Education in America, with him. And kind of the rest is history after that. But there's just so much I could talk about, but I'll summarize it this way and then stop, okay? Because I could go on and on. So you'll have to wait for the autobiography when that comes out, and it's going to have a lot of fascinating stories in it, I promise you, okay? My life is full of sometimes I think back at it and I can't even believe those things really happened. But anyway, I would say to all of you that the biggest influences on who I am and the work I do, my writing, my research, my teaching, first and foremost, I had two wonderful parents Nathaniel and Barbara Wildcat. Those were the most important mentors in my life. Not every person can say that, but I was very lucky. My brother and I were both lucky to have very loving parents, supportive parents. That's number one. Number two, Vine Deloria Jr., when I met him in '87, that was my second year, really going into my second year of teaching at Haskell, became that became an incredible learning opportunity for me, the chance to work with him, to kind of hear him tell his stories about U of A and about then when he moved to Boulder, University of Colorado, and again, I got to be a part of that group of all of these graduate students, that he had helped shepherd through graduate school. And so it was really wonderful. So he was an influence. The second big influence on my work is Vine Deloria Jr. And then the third, last but not least, is Haskell Indian Nations University. I really think the kind of scholarship I do, the kind of work I do, would not, if I had gone someplace else, I don't think I would be writing, thinking, and working the way I do today. So I'm very lucky to have been this last 4 decades now, going into, well into the 4th decade of being at Haskell Indian Nations University, meeting great students like Millie and a bunch of students, so many I can't even name them all, but are going on now and doing really great work. So I'll stop there, and then we can say, anyone have any questions about that sort of odd discussion of my life?
Well, I think it's just kind of me and you, and then my friend Des over here. But I have a lot of questions, and
Okay.
First off, that's really cool. I think that it's really interesting that you say that you grew up kind of in a predominantly white community, but you didn't really notice because you weren't a threat. And that's kind of how I was too at Dobson High. There was only 28 Indians. Okay. And then 2 of them were my brother and my sister and me. And so that was 3 of us out of the 28. Okay. But I think that does give you a perspective of knowing, like you said, knowing not really your enemy, because I don't want to make any enemies here, but knowing the community that you're going up against. Yeah. In terms of, so I think that that's important to kind of know your community. And I think that, that was a really good point that you made. Now, I do want to ask you, can you explain a little bit about the creation of the medicine wheel? Were there any challenges from the Native and non-Native community? And what does it symbolize?
Yeah, because I think I may have it very handy here. Let's see, it's funny because I just printed out a copy of the statement. I'm going to call this up because it's just a 1-page statement. No, I'm not going to read it, but so the medicine wheel came about. Here's how the medicine wheel came about. And again, there'll be a whole chapter in my autobiography about the medicine wheel. So I was at Haskell. I went to an American Indian and AHEC meeting, American Indian Higher Education Consortium meeting. That's the consortium of all the tribal colleges and universities. I went to a meeting in Billings, Montana, the fall of 1991. So this is the year before the quote, big 500-year anniversary of the arrival of Christopher Columbus, or Cristobal Colon, 1992. So this is a meeting, the fall 1991, an American Indian Higher Education Consortium meeting. And I noticed that they had 2 elders that were going to give a presentation, Northern Cheyenne elders. You may have heard this story before, Millie, but it won't hurt to hear it again. I met at that small session. There probably weren't more than 6 people in their session. but I went in, and there I met Bill Tallbull and Ted Rising Sun, two well-known Northern Cheyenne leaders, elders. And they were just kind of talking about how important they felt education was, what education should be. And we're doing a really fascinating critique of colonial education, you know, the settler education about who we were. And so when they asked for questions, I raised the question about 1492 and the upcoming quincentennial. And they both had really good responses. I remember they said, you know, there are a lot of ways that people can respond, and you're going to have to decide for yourself the most appropriate way. Said some people will protest, and that's all right. You know, some people are going to want to take to the streets and protest and castigate, you know, Cristobal Colon. He says, some people may want to just get together and pray and use it as a time for reflection about, you know, hey, what have we really learned? Kind of more rather than a celebration, a commemoration event. Okay. And he says, and that would be good too. And then they said, I think it was Bill who said, you know, I think, though, he said, one of the things that I think we should do is, this is an opportunity for us next year to share some of our wisdom, some of our understanding of who we are. We've been listening to 500 years. The settlers tell us about their history and who they are and what values and religion and language and what art should be, and so on and so forth, what government should look like. And he says, I think maybe it would be a good time for us to share something about who we are. So that was the seed that got planted. That was the seed. So I heard that. And I just started thinking about that. So October, November, December, the holidays come. I'm still thinking this in the back of my head. I keep thinking, man, we really ought to do something to share with the world some of our incredible wisdom, something about our complex worldviews. And you know, at that time, by the way, I knew that Bill had been really involved. He's the one who set up, what is it? I think the Park Service, or is it Forest Service, the protection of the Medicine Wheel site up there in the Bighorn Mountain Range of the Northern Rockies. So there's a Medicine Wheel site there, and Bill was really responsible for getting that honored and protected from being desecrated by people coming up there and moving stones and wanting to take souvenirs from this sacred site. And so I kept thinking about this, and then this is what happened. Bumped into a good friend of mine, the crop artist, Stan Herd, H-E-R-D. If you Google him, you'll see a bunch of his work. But I had met Stan through a lot of friends and stuff, and we like to get our guitars out and play. Really, we're both just frustrated rock and rollers. We really wish we had grown up and become, you know, rock and rollers. And but we have our guitars, and we get out every once in a while and play. So I knew Stan. And he said, hey, let's go to coffee. And so we went downtown, Lawrence, and a little cafe right downtown Mass Street. And lo and behold, we start talking about what he's going to do, what he's thinking about. And at the time, some of you may remember, I'm really dating this. I know this is before most of you were born, but there was a horrible desecration activity going on along the Ohio River in Kentucky, on the south side banks of the Ohio River as it goes along the northern edge of Kentucky. And this was in Time magazine, Newsweek magazine, but people had discovered there were some ancient burials there, and people were literally just going there and digging up artifacts, pipes, prayer, materials that were used for prayers and bones. And it was horrible. It was just a horrible desecration. And Stan said, I've been invited by some people that are kind of working with that whole thing, and they're from Ohio on the north side of the river, and they kind of talking to me about maybe going up there and doing something about in relationship to this whole Columbus Day thing, right? That's where Columbus, Ohio is. And he says, but I really don't know anyone up there, and I feel kind of weird about that. And so as we talked, it just really hit me. It said, okay. I said, Stan, what would you think maybe about doing some kind of landscape art piece here? And because I've been thinking about this a lot. And anyway, we talked it over, chewed it over, jumped in his pickup truck and drove right to Haskell. And we just started driving around. And we started up at the front of the campus, and we're looking at some, areas in the open kind of lawn areas. And then I don't know, but I said, let's go around the south side, because, I said, we got some large open spaces down there. And we parked the pickup truck and we started walking. Where that road is, Millie, right, that goes right down that old gravel road that goes down into the wetlands, just south
Barker.
We started walking down that road that goes right into the middle of the wetlands. This is the gravel road. It's just south of the facilities building. And there's a gate there now, and you can't drive down there. They don't want people to drive down there anymore. Probably a good idea. But we started walking around down there, and we got down there to this place, and it was clearly on the edge of the wetlands, grasslands, and we both just got fascinated by it. And I said, wow, this could really be cool. You got a lot of space. You could do whatever you want. And then I mentioned to him, have you ever seen the medicine wheel image? And he said, maybe, I don't know. And I said, well, I'll send you some images, of the medicine wheel, that kind of design. And that's how the seed was planted. I knew medicine wheels there. I didn't know that I was pretty sure there hadn't been ever any, quote, medicine wheels in Kansas, or at least any that I knew of. And so I started going around and talking to people who had been at Haskell for a long time, people I kind of considered as elders. I talked to Andy Gertie. I talked to Dawn and Marilyn Brad. I just went around at that time. I talked to Henry Collins, who worked in security there, and he was a great singer, great Southern singer. And I just said, what do you guys think? Would it be appropriate for us to put this medicine wheel image down there? And all of them, after we talked about it a while, said, you know what? We represent here on this campus all of the federally recognized tribes of this Turtle Island. He said, they said, and we think this medicine wheel, those 4 sacred directions and what that means, the power of the center, what those cardinal directions represent, the way we're all connected with that circle. We think that would be appropriate here at Haskell. And so that's how it was born. I introduced, after I got the blessing of people I considered kind of elders on campus, I connected him up with Leslie Evans, Dwayne Leslie Evans, a Citizen Spam Potawatomi artist on our campus, who was teaching art at the time. And they worked with students and kind of drew this design and created this image, and worked that summer. Most of that summer of 1992, to get that medicine wheel image in place. And that's how it came. And once we started working on it, once people found out about it, just all of a sudden people were reaching out and contacting us and saying, well, what are you going to do? Are you going to do something special on, quote, Columbus Day, or now we would say Indigenous Peoples Day? We said, yeah, we're going to do a very special kind of convening and honoring of this place. And, at the time, I wasn't even thinking about the boarding school children who might have taken their last breath down there in that wetlands. There's still good reason to believe there are unmarked burials of Native children in those wetlands. But I wasn't even thinking of that. And at that time, well, I had heard about the South Lawrence Traffic Way. I wasn't even thinking about the South Lawrence Traffic Way. All I was thinking about is this image, the power of this image. So in short, we put that there as a way to share something about who the worldview of the first peoples of this place, a worldview where we've always, tend to think of the world in a very relational framework. We don't see the world full of resources. We see it full of relatives. We're not fixated on rights. Yes, we honor, we recognize how important rights are, but we know rights are hollow unless they're connected with responsibilities. And so when you live among resources, all people do is talk about who has the right to use this or that resource. When you live among relatives, you've got to ask yourself, what's your responsibility to live well with the land, with the air, with the water, with the plants and animals? Because we're not living with resources, we're living among relatives. And then so much spins out of that. And that's really why we put the medicine wheel there. We thought it was such an iconic symbol that captures that. And so I'll send you, Millie, the one page. I just found it the other day. I'll send you the one-page statement that we crafted about the purpose of the medicine wheel and why we put it there. Okay?
Oh my gosh, that would be awesome. Yeah, we're approaching here an hour, and I don't really want to take up too much of your time, but I do have like a million questions that I want to ask you, but I'm just only going to ask you a few of them.
Okay,
I have like
go
13
ahead.
questions lined up.
Okay.
But like still in regards to this medicine wheel, people in Lawrence have accused Haskell of creating a sacred place.
Yes.
Like I recently read this article where you had to defend you weren't making a sacred place. They're sacred places are in and of themselves.
Right.
But in regards to the sacred places discussion, a lot of sacred lands, a lot of Native peoples have been removed from their sacred places.
Yes.
A lot of sacred places have been destroyed.
Yes.
Should we, as Native communities, to kind of offset that balance, should we create more of these sacred areas?
Okay. Now, it's funny you asked that question because I'm overdue now on an article. I promised Suzanne Schoen Harjow for a publication that's going to deal specifically with the issue of sacred sites. And the topic that I chose to address was just that issue. So Vine Deloria wrote this famous piece in the Native American, the NARF Legal Review. I want to say it was 89 or 90. And it's been republished in a lot of his books. You can find it, his anthologies. But in it, he talks about sacred places. And the most intriguing thing he says is okay, there's these kinds of, there are, he makes the argument, sort of different levels. Everything is sacred, right? But there are places that are more sacred than others, and that's a function of what has occurred there, what has happened there. And he goes through kind of discussing these three layers or levels of sacredness and how they should be respected and honored. And then he says something really fascinating. He says, but there's a fourth kind of sacred site we need to also be thinking about, and that is the sacred places that will be revealed to us in the future. And I've thought about that a lot. In other words, are we really prepared, and are our tribal nations really thinking about what that means to say, are we prepared to receive new sacred places? And then the whole question of what does that mean? Does it make a difference? I mean, if you really start thinking about it, this is where we can get into really some really deep and important questions. I'm writing this piece down. I'm saying we really need to think about this, because you and I probably know some people that if they came up and said I visited this place and I had this sacred thing that happened to me, my first reaction might be, well, tell me what you were smoking first, okay? I might be a little bit suspicious. I might, I don't know about that, But we think about that, okay, so it doesn't matter. What if Millie comes, walking across campus one day and, this voice comes to her and tells her, lay tobacco down here, lay sweetgrass. This is a sacred place, and must be protected. Now, so how would we even deal with that? Would most people say, oh, you know how Millie is, she's crazy anyway, I just ignore it? Or would we say, okay, no, we need to think about this? And so Vine believed very clearly the difference between Christian traditions and indigenous traditions. All of their miracles happened in the past. Deloria says that's a dead religion. Their religion was alive when all of those miracles were happening, but they don't believe in miracles anymore. Our traditions are living. And he says we should be prepared to have new sacred places revealed to us. I'll be honest with you. I've thought about this even in terms of the medicine wheel. Does the medicine wheel not something that we made sacred, but that we just sort of somehow ended up honoring this place, not really even understanding fully at the time we did it what the power of that place was? I don't know. I'm not making an argument, but I'm saying those are the kinds of questions we need to think about. And I think that's really going to be, it's going to be difficult work. It's going to be controversial. I mean, talk about tribal politics. You get tribal politics all into this, but I think the key thing that we've got to keep our mind on is saying, are we really gonna let our religious traditions become things where, oh, all the miracles happened in the past? Or do we believe the power of the sacred is with us right now, right here and now? And if it is, why shouldn't we expect the powers of the sacred to reveal themselves to us in particular places and tell us this place is special. This place should be honored. And are we even prepared to receive that? And what are the protocols we would go through to make a determination? And do we even talk about it? I mean, so here would be a kind of an interesting question. Well, if you find those places, the last thing you want to do is talk about it, because you don't want people to know about it. That's one view. But you see, if you start thinking about that very deeply, I think this is something that we really need to work on and think about, Millie, because I think that there are sacred places waiting to reveal themselves to you and your children, to my grandchildren. But are we even going to have the mindfulness to recognize those places? Will we be in right relations with the balance of creation to be able to have those experiences? And then if we do, how do we deal with that? Great question. And so I'm writing about that right now.
No, that's a really like kind of leads into my next question. And again,
Okay.
I won't ask you too many more questions, a couple more
Okay.
questions here, but and I know that you've noticed it here at Haskell Indian Nations University, but as each passing generation, Native peoples are becoming more homogenized.
Yeah.
Even when I went there, you
Yeah.
know, I was like best friends with like Cherokee people, and
Oh,
we
sure.
had the same, grew up with like the same music and really connected, like
Sure.
just in our own same thoughts. And we dressed the same. We talked English.
Oh, yeah.
We didn't speak our indigenous languages. And, you know, now with all of us using phones and using social media, should, you know, I've been told like from elders that the language of Earth is indigenous languages.
Uh-huh. Mhm.
And maybe if we were to discover those sacred places, we would need to learn how to speak the language, which would be the indigenous language of those places. And so there was a lady on Facebook who wrote, she was a Navajo lady,
Uh-huh.
and she wrote that if anybody wants, if you're Navajo and you want to receive any kind of services from us, scholarships or any kind of educational funds, you need to learn how to speak Navajo.
Yeah.
Should tribes be forcing their members to learn language and culture in exchange for services?
Yeah, I don't think so. This is, and maybe you've heard me tell this story before, okay? But I will. I'm going to tell you a story. So it's two stories, but they're connected. So that meeting that I met, sponsored by the National Endowment for the Humanities, a summer workshop where I met Vine, there was a great discussion in that workshop about language preservation. And there was one guy there, he was Blackfoot, named Gerald Kipp, K-I-P, maybe double P, Kipp, Gerald Kipp. And he was all in on native languages. We've got to do everything we can to save native languages. We got to put it in our schools and everything. And that was his mantra. And at first, everyone was kind of like going, yeah, we've got to do that. We've got to do that. We've got to do that. Okay. And then there was a young man there, and his name was Bobby Knight, not like the basketball. Well, yeah, I guess like the basketball coach. No, Bobby Wright was his name. Bobby Wright was his name. And I believe he was Blackfoot too. And he was a young PhD, really dynamic kind of scholar. And he kind of, when he first started, he kind of shocked everyone. He says, well, I'm against that. And people said, well, why? And he said, so I've had this discussion with some of my family, my elders, and they told me that our language is one of the most precious gifts the Creator gave us. And they say that given the preciousness of this gift, it is wrong to force it on people who don't want it and don't respect it. And that even means some of our own people. They said our language will thrive when people come to us and say, we want to know our language. And he was making a strong case that we shouldn't be mandating that everyone learn the language, because then his ancestors were saying, they'll learn it just the way kids learn Spanish in junior high. You know, they learn how to greet themselves, but they don't ever really learn the language. They couldn't really speak it. But again, they're living the language, they're learning the language kind of as, quote, again, I'll use this analogy, kind of a textbook learning of a language, but it's a dead language. They don't really use it. They learn it, they can speak it, but when they go to the grocery store, they speak English. When they go, get their car worked on, they speak English. And I've thought about this a lot because I think this is an interesting point. And I really got to where I really kind of see where Bobby was coming from. He was saying, his elders were saying, if our language is meant to live, our people will come to us and ask us to teach that language. And then someone said, well, what happens if they don't? I mean, these kids are all watching their TikTok and YouTube or whatever, the latest craze is on social media. And so what if they don't? What if you lose the language? And then Bobby, his response to that, well, I was told in the language may disappear for a time. But there's always this opening, this like cosmic portal where it could come back too. Now, that's the first story, which is a really interesting one because it's kind of like, no, we shouldn't be forcing native language instruction on kids who really don't want it, whose parents speak it and everything, because they're not going to respect it. That was his argument. And then we got into this whole thing in another class. This is a Haskell class, Millie, about 20 years later, I'm teaching. And we get into this discussion about who should learn native languages. Now, you can identify with this at U of A. I'll bet you can study. I'll bet you there are people who can enroll in native language courses, and they're not even native. But they can learn to speak Dene, maybe. I don't know. Maybe they can learn to speak Lakota. Okay. And there would be some native people who make the argument, no, that's not right. Again, that same kind of thing that, they won't respect our language. They won't fully understand it. And therefore, this is ours and we should only keep it for ourselves. And I had a man who was older in that class. Come to think of it, I don't think he was Blackfoot, but he was definitely from Montana, Millie, one of the Montana tribes, this older guy. And he said, it was interesting because it's kind of this similar kind of philosophy Bobby was talking about. He says, I don't care if they're red, yellow, black, or white. If a person comes to me in the right way and says, I would like to learn your language, he says, I will teach it to them. They may have no tribal connection. But he says, he was making this point, it's about respect. And so that to me is again, that you, as usual, Millie, you're asking the tough questions. That is a really good question. And I don't think I've got a definite answer on it. I would say, I think every tribal nation remember what we said, it's not one size fits all. I think every tribal nation's going to have to make up their mind about how they maintain their cultural traditions, including language. And is that widely shared? Is it held very close to the people? I think you will see a range of responses, right? But those are really good. Those are the kinds of things we need to have young scholars like you and activists writing about, because these are the real issues that people like my grandchildren are going to face. Yeah.
Yeah, we had Antonio speak last week, and he told us that when a deer sees a human, he doesn't say, oh, he's black, white, Indian, or a specific tribe. He just sees a man. And he says the fire is the same way. When someone comes to the fire, they're supposed to be there. We're supposed to help them. It's an orphan fire.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So it's really interesting, you know, when you start diving into it, and I'm perfectly comfortable for my part saying these are the kinds of discussions we need to have in our own families, in our own communities, in our own nations, and kind of figure out, you know, how we are going to do it. Now, you're in the Southwest, so you probably know this, you know, I mean, I'm just talking about my perception, and I could be wrong, but you know, when you go up on those northern plains, particularly among those Lakota and Dakota people, you know, they're always sharing. They're always sharing, you know, and they'll invite you into a sweat lodge. They'll invite you to a ceremony. But you go to the Pueblos, and they hold their culture and ceremonial traditions very close to themselves. And people don't get invited in the kiva. You may be a great person, you may be a great friend, but they're not going to invite you into the kiva because they just a different way of dealing with how they understand that. And that's fine. I think that's one of the good things we just have to keep reminding ourselves of. Like the earth itself, it's made up of this incredible biological diversity. And if the planet's going to remain healthy, we need a very vibrant cultural diversity. Those two are linked.
Yeah, I'm going to write an article called Kicked Out of the Kiva.
Don't quote me. Don't quote me, Millie. You get me in trouble. You get me in trouble now. Yeah. Don't quote me.
All right. Well, I have a whole bunch of other questions, but I'm just going to go ahead and ask you this last one, because we're approaching an hour and a half. But, you know, Chief Arvil Looking Horse, the keeper of the sacred pipe, he said that he was told when he was given it that he may be the last keeper if we don't learn how to respect Mother Earth. And he also goes on to say in a message that since 1994, there has been a white buffalo calf born every year. And there was one born last year in October. He warned that this was a blessing and a warning. So do you believe that the earth, animals, plants are trying to warn us that we need to change our ways?
Absolutely.
And if so, how now? How?
Absolutely. I mean, all you've got to do is pay attention to the plants, to the animals, to the earth, to the wind, to the water. Everything is in the earth that's not of our making is telling us that humans have been behaving very, very badly. And the warning signs are there. And you know, so again, I'm trying to finish up another book. I got too many writing projects. I'm trying to do it once, but one is I'm under the gun right now to finish up my book on indigenous ingenuity. And I was just writing something the other night, and I said, you know, one of the things that is the difference between the Red Alert that I wrote back, 2009, it's over 12 years old now. It's hard to believe that. But, you know, so you probably heard, you know, the United Nations back in February of 2021 issued this, the head of the United Nations issued what he called a code red alert about climate change. And I said, well, you know, I'm really glad. What I said was, you know, I was a little bit sad that it took the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 12 years to issue their code red climate alert, because the planet, I said, has been issuing a red alert for much longer than that. And if you'll remember how I discussed this in red alert, this is what I say. I'm not issuing the alert. I'm just a messenger. I'm telling you, this is what the planet is telling us now, with the fires, with the flooding, with the extreme weather, with these pandemic diseases. The earth is letting us know we've been treating her very badly for far too long. And it's time for us to pay attention. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely, you know, and it all goes back to create, you know, relating our communities back to our environments and trying to increase those biodiversities in these American communities.
Yeah, that's
it's really hard to do.
That is
I know,
really,
that's a whole other.
no, I was going to say that we'll save that discussion for next time. Okay.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's going to be a whole nother one. But anyway, with respect to your time, I just want to say thank you so much. So many notes here, so much knowledge that you shared with us. I, you know, really appreciate everything that you shared. I mean, I don't even know where to begin. I never knew your story. I was like listening to your story about Coffeyville, and it's just so interesting, you know.
Wait till you read the book. Then you'll really.
I'll tell you what, I had the worst cup of coffee in Coffeyville. I was like, what the heck is this? They're definitely.
Don't order coffee in Coffeyville. That's not how they got the name. That's not how they got the name. Okay. Okay, I gotta run. Sanlai. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. You have a great day, Dr. Wildcat.
Bye-bye.